Hello, friends, and welcome to Lost and Unfound, where we tell the tales and explore the lives of the formerly famous, the infamous, and the forgotten. I'm Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. Today's topic is Lysander Spooner. Have you ever heard of him?
Huh?
Probably not. Ever met anyone named Lysander? No? Well, me neither. Well, not only was his name unusual, so were his opinions and his life. So come join us as we learn more about the radical, anarcho-libertarian philosopher and reformer with the wacky ideas and the wacky name Lysander Spooner. Spooner was born January 19th, 1808, in the central Massachusetts mill town of Athol, the progeny of old Yankee stock that had arrived in Plymouth just a generation or so after the Pilgrims. His parents were Asa and Dolly, and he worked the family farm along with 8 siblings. His family was not particularly political, it seems, but they were committed abolitionists, and Spooner recalled in later years that his family had detested slavery for as long as he or anybody else could remember. Also important to point out here is that old Asa, his father, was an early adopter of deism, that Enlightenment tradition adhered to by many of the country's founders, including Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, Paine, and many others. The radicalism that he exhibited throughout his life was not driven by religious zeal, but more by secular outrage against what he perceived as injustice and hypocrisy. It's a curious footnote, I think, that Asa named 2 of his boys Leander and Lysander after heroes of Greek antiquity. There are no Johns or Bills in the Spooner household, and if Spooner is not an odd enough surname, how about Lysander as his given name? And at the risk of frivolity, I feel compelled to point out that his grandfather bested them all in the silly name competition, he being a captain in the Revolutionary War named, wait for it, Wing, W-I-N-G, Wing Spooner. Now, just try going through high school today with a name like that. Though born into modest means and with irregular formal education, young Lysander somehow managed to inculcate himself into some lofty circles in the Bay State at a ripe age. He did this while pursuing a 3-year study of the law under the tutelage of some local heavyweights. These included Charles Allen, a U.S. representative from the radical abolitionist Free Soil Party, and Honest John Davis, a congressman and future governor representing the anti-Jacksonian Whig Party. There is a sticking point here, though, as state law stipulated that those that had not graduated from college required 5 years of study to read for the bar, rather than the customary 3 for those that had. Spooner had never attended college of any kind, and he seemed to be unashamed of this. So in what is the first known example of a life spent fighting the system, he ignores this law. In fact, he rejects all licenses for all occupations and goes about his ways, and he eventually opens a small law practice in nearby Worcester. He writes, quote,
"No one has ever yet advocated in direct terms so monstrous a principle as yet the rich ought to be protected by law from the competition of the poor."
Though he succeeds in persuading the state legislature to abandon this regulation, which it did in 1836, his law practice soon failed, as does a brief and ill-conceived pursuit of land speculation in the Western Reserve of Ohio. So now back in Massachusetts in 1844, he tries his hand at a new and much bolder endeavor, which again is brashly at odds with the governmental powers that be. This enterprise was called the American Letter Mail Company, and though it sounds pretty innocuous, it took aim at not just a state regulatory board, but the entire United States Post Office. And let's try to keep in mind that then, unlike now, the U.S. Postal Service was very important to the wider citizenry. He was not alone in his day, nor would he be now, in arguing that this bloated behemoth was unjust, unproductive, and too expensive. And so he thought to usurp its monopoly over the mails, which was then a very big topic of discussion as the country rapidly expanded westward. To that end, he managed to open offices in the major cities along the eastern seaboard, at which a customer could buy stamps directly and then have them sent to satellite affiliates throughout the land for delivery to the recipient. Not so complicated, right? He was initially successful, though not for long. We all know that governments fear competition above all else, and so it didn't take long for the feds to clamp down on little Lysander's budding enterprise. Though the National Letter Mail Service managed to bring customer costs down significantly, markedly heightened efficiency, a series of laws were enacted that shuttered the business by 1851, effectively ending his foray into commerce once and for all. Bloodied but unbowed by his tangles with the regulatory state that he loathed, he turned his attention to the pen. It is through the several books and pamphlets that he attempted to better explain and advocate for the often controversial reforms that have since defined him. Though much of his thinking may seem somewhat contradictory today, it would have been likely more coherent to the radical audience of his time to which he addressed. So after a very short break, let's dig a little deeper into what Lysander Spooner believed and fought for throughout the remainder of his days. As alluded to earlier, deism was a fundamental tenet to his thinking and an inspiration to his wider advocacy for topics that we'll touch on next, namely abolition of slavery, free speech, natural rights, individualism, and various legal matters that apply to all of those. Now, what is deism? Well, it's a topic way too big for this show, and I'm in no way an expert on the subject, but we'll do our best to describe it in a nutshell. Simply put, deism is the belief in a higher power that is expressed not through revelation or denominational adherence, but through nature. As such, deists tend to believe in reason and logic over superstition and supposition. Deists do not reject the existence of God, but they are typically skeptical of its purported interpretation by the apparatus of an organized religion. In other words, they believe that all nature was created by a higher power, but that God plays a different role, or no role at all, in the behaviors of those whom he created. This rationalist approach left an indelible mark on all of Spooner's writings, including his first two works. The first one being, quote, The Deist's Immortality, an essay on man's accountability for his belief. And then his other one, The Deist's Reply to the Alleged Supernatural Evidences of Creativity, both of which were written while he was still in his 20s. This influence no doubt led to his robust participation in the abolitionist cause, which reached its crescendo during his lifetime. But even within these usually chummy circle, I guess, of fellow travelers, it's only a matter of time before he starts to squabble over doctrine and practice. It seems like he wasn't an easy guy to deal with. In his 1845 book titled The Unconstitutionality of Slavery, Spooner espoused the textualist interpretation of the U.S. Constitution regarding the, quote, originalist view. He argued that not only was slavery immoral and irrational, it was illegal. His contentions were that the so-called peculiar institution was unlawful, as that no slave states had ever officially authorized that institution. And that not only was it in violation of natural law, its practice was openly inconsistent with many passages supported by the founding documents of the country. These views put him at intellectual loggerheads with many of the more prominent anti-slavery campaigners of the day, such as William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips. They and others contended that the Constitution did allow legal slavery, and therefore should be amended to remove Article 4, Section 2, the so-called extradition clause. Well, this gets very complicated, and this has been debated ever since the Constitution was written. But this is how the feuding parties dealt with this. Well, it's impossible to quantify how persuasive Spooner's arguments were, but he did manage to sway two other very prominent abolitionists of the day to his side, and those being Frederick Douglass and Gerrit Smith. Well, let's talk some of his wider political beliefs, which are very wide-ranging and unconventional then and today. Many definitive terms have been ascribed to Spooner over time, with a whole range of claimants to his name, and as we've mentioned, his views often seem contradictory in a conventional sense, though he no doubt would have seen his wider philosophy as being sound and consistent. Among the isms cast his way are, quote, individualist anarchism, quote, right libertarianism, quote, left libertarianism, quote, anti-capitalist individualism, and many others, too numerous to mention here. Throughout his rather long life and ever since, he seems to be equally cherished by the few that know of him as a bold and unyielding freedom fighter to some, and alternately dismissed as a sort of eccentric, meddlesome quack by others. Though it was his core belief in the individual versus arbitrary state authority that probably best defines his admittedly obscure legacy today. He makes his most prominent case in defense of natural law and against the tyranny of the states in a series of pamphlets called, quote, No Treason, written in 1870, when he was then in his early 60s. In these writings, he argues vehemently, as did many of the founders, that all law is derived from birth, not from fellow man, and as such, quote, all men are created equal. Well, we know this line, but he wanted to expound on that. And this doctrinaire position is applied to the justification, or at least the acquiescence, to human bondage, put him at odds with many of the founders whom he otherwise revered. It was this raw belief in natural law that translates neatly into his abhorrence of slavery, as he believed nature was colorblind. This might not seem very radical today, but in the 19th century in which he lived, it remained controversial and hotly contested. He then goes on to remind the reader that the United States was established as a constitutional republic and not as a democracy, which, of course, is so often falsely and erroneously called today. He lays out 7 distinct points to buttress his argument, and they are at the root of his being considered a member of the Anarchist and libertarian schools. And they go like this. Number 1, a man's natural right is his own. Therefore, no one should try to impose authority over him. 2, it is not acceptable that the majority creates government over the minority. There needs to be equality of thought and opinion regardless of numbers. 3, the Constitution does not mention it was created by the, quote, majority, but by the, quote, people. 4, our forefathers did not claim that majorities should rule, for they themselves were a minority. 5, majority rule does not guarantee a just decision. 6, if a government is established by force and with the support of a majority, the members of such have fallen under ignorance and corruption. 7, allowing for a majority to have power over a minority simply creates a contest of ideas between members of each group. And now he gets to the very title of his collected letters, where he discusses treason both literally and figuratively, and his individualist streak hits full stride. He writes, quote,
"If a man has never consented or agreed to support a government, he breaks no faith in refusing to support it."
He then alludes to the American War of Independence to support his argument. And after this, he takes on taxes, which only endears him further to the few libertarians today that know his name. He refers to politicians with taxing authority as dishonest robbers and racketeers. Well, Spooner continued to write away and collaborated on occasion with another notable individualist and proto-anarchist, I guess that's the best way to call him, and his name being Josiah Warren. His work also had considerable influence on a man that would come to espouse similar views some years later, that being Benjamin Tucker. And as this show progresses, you can learn more about both of them on future episodes. Lysander spent the rest of his life writing away and wasting away, I guess, usually amongst the stacks of the Boston Athenaeum. And he died in that city just shy of his 80th birthday in 1886.
This concludes the latest episode of Lost and Unfound. Find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and all the socials. And if you like what you hear, check out our companion show called Well Hung History. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.